So my name is Dennis Culhane, and I'm a professor of social policy at the University of Pennsylvania. My primary area of research is homelessness, housing emergencies, and programs, policies that can address those. I got involved in this area of research about 35 years ago. I had had a kind of formative experience when I was an undergrad and working for a summer as a volunteer at a program that provided meals and shelter to people who were homeless. And the problem was just emerging in a newly significant way in the mid 1980s when I was entering grad school. The research literature was pretty weak, very limited. I did not get into doing research in the area expecting that I would be here 35 years later still doing it. As I mentioned, the limited research really sort of inspired me to try to figure out what were some areas that could be, where shining a light on a spot could really improve our understanding. And so I developed a whole set of research projects and eventually landed on using administrative data as a way to understand homelessness longitudinally, looking at the policy impacts, the relationship of homelessness to other major social welfare programs, public expenditures, et cetera. And so that sort of led to a long-term research agenda of that type.
That's awesome. Yeah, I feel like when I searched the literature, your name came up immediately because you started doing this work a long time ago. And so maybe if you could help us understand, we all know that California right now has one of the worst homelessness problems in the country. So could you maybe give us the top 3 reasons that you think are contributing to this problem?
Sure, there's actually been a few studies. There's a whole niche of literature that looks at the community level factors that explain variations in the homelessness rate across the country. And 2 recent studies, I think, have been particularly informative about California and the West Coast in general. One was a study that was undertaken using data from Zillow. A postdoc who was at Zillow at the time partnered with myself and some other researchers and looked at the relationship between the growth in housing prices relative to incomes, and noting that once you cross the threshold of a median rent to income ratio that goes above 30% of income, housing costs as a portion of income, then you see this accelerating rate of homelessness. And it maps pretty closely to what's happened since 2014. Homelessness in California, unsheltered homelessness has increased by about 75% since 2014. And that corresponds to this accelerating increase in housing costs, especially relative to the fixed incomes of people with disabilities and others. So I think that's a pretty powerful study that really helped to explain the relationship between rents and homelessness. The other one recently done by Tom Byrne and some colleagues at Boston University looked specifically at income inequality, because one of the drivers of rental market price increases has been the increase of relatively high income renters in these high tech cities, where you have the big tech giants coming in, starting salaries are $100,000 and people don't even think twice about paying $3,000 a month for rent on a unit that, 6 or 7 years ago was half that price. And every landlord wants to have a tenant like that. So you've got the whole positioning of the rental market is orienting towards this type of tenant. So we're having a net loss of units relative to the number of people coming into these markets. So I think income inequality has imprinted itself on the rental housing market and really distorted that market such that there's been a tremendous loss of affordable units, especially things that might have been kind of marginal, but where a lot of fragile people with, intermittent incomes, very low incomes, with disabilities, they were able to hang on into some of these living situations that have basically disappeared.
For a random person, homeless person in California, or if you have data on Philadelphia or New York City, that's fine too. Like, what is the likelihood that the person is unsheltered, is chronically homeless, has mental illness and substance abuse, and has criminal records?
So about, and it's important to keep in mind, about 600,000 people are counted as homeless on a given night in the last couple of years. And we know that those counts are imperfect and they miss people because they only count visibly homeless people. Okay, so it arguably the number is probably 750,000 or something like that, so it's bigger than the 600,000. And we know the number of people who pass through the emergency shelter system in the United States is about 2 million people a year. Okay, I think the last count was like 1.6 or 1.7 million. So that just gives you a sense of the overall one night versus 1 year kind of measure. It's about 0.4% of the US population. But the problem is experienced quite disproportionately by different groups. Obviously, nearly all people who are homeless are poor. So the rate of homelessness in a year among poor people is somewhere between 4 and 6% in a year. And furthermore, we know it's disproportionately experienced by people of color, so that people who are African American are almost 4 times as likely, 3.5 times as likely to be homeless as white people, accounting for 40% of the homeless nationwide. In a study we did once in New York City, we found that 25% of the poor Black men in their 30s and 40s experienced homelessness in just 1 year. Okay, so as you go into different cells, smaller race by sex by age groups, you begin to see how the problem, while it might sound like it's a small number relative to a large US population of 330 million people, when you get down to the groups that are actually at risk, poor people, people of color, you find the rates are actually astonishingly high, and that there are some groups for whom the odds of being homeless are dramatically high in any given 5-year period, including likely 40%, 50% chance in some cases. So I think that's important to put the relative risk in context. In terms of the population, what's their circumstances? If you look at the adult homeless population, which is about 70% of the homeless population is a single adult, 30% are people who are in a family. Of that adult population, half of them are sheltered and half are unsheltered, okay, based on the most recent count. And most people are unsheltered because there is not shelter available to them. So it's not as though there's, this huge vacancy rate in the shelters that people could go into. And of course, that problem is very differential geographically across the country. And on the West Coast and in California, about 70% of the adult homeless are unsheltered, which is an alarmingly high number. And it's increased, as I said, significantly since 2014. And whereas contrast that with a place like New York City, or a lot of cities in the industrial Northeast, historically industrial and Northeast, they have unsheltered rates closer to 5% or 10%. Some cities have no unsheltered homeless people. So the condition is quite variable around the country, and the circumstances people find them in is quite variable. And it looks different in rural areas also relative to urban areas. So anyway, those are I think some big picture numbers for you.
I want to go back to one paper that I read that you co-authored. It was great. And then so you guys did a study in Philadelphia, and you looked at the most severe, most chronically homeless individuals. And then you showed that 58% of them had diagnosis of serious mental illness or a history of substance abuse treatment. So that suggests that 58% is a lower bound because,
Right.
you know, some people are, you know, undiagnosed or didn't seek treatment. So can you talk about that?
Yeah, so in terms of the composition, first of all, just let me distinguish chronic homelessness is if you look at the people who come into homelessness over the course of a year, about 15%, maybe as high as 20% of those people will continue to be homeless for a year or more. And that constitutes the chronically homeless population. 80% of the population that's homeless is actually homeless for brief periods of time. They're in and out relatively within like, you know, mean time of like 6 weeks. In fact, the highest proportion of people exit within the first week of becoming homeless. So most people find the condition to be so disturbing and anxiety provoking that they do anything they can to get out of homelessness as quickly as possible, and they succeed, which is, I think, really amazing. But there's a group of people who can't get out on their own, and they need structured programs to help them, mostly because they have a disability. Sort of the signature feature of chronic homelessness is a disability, and primarily a disability related to behavioral health. Substance abuse is the dominant condition among people who are chronically homeless. About, you know, as you said, a lower boundary estimate would be 70, 80% of the population has had a treatment for a substance abuse issue. Serious mental illness is much less prevalent compared to substance abuse, but about 20 to 25% of the single adult homeless population has a serious mental illness, meaning schizophrenia or a major affective psychosis. Okay. And just to put that in context, if you compare, if there have been epidemiologic studies of the general population, and you know, if the most common case of homelessness is a Black male who's unmarried and poor, the rate of schizophrenia or serious mental illness rather in that population is about 13%. Okay, so to have a rate of 20% or 25% in the homeless population is not that extreme. It's twice as high, but you know, it's relative to the population from which they're drawn. It's not extremely as high.
So I mean, if you're looking at the homeless in the population as a whole, like it's about 25%, which is not, it's high, but it's not scarily high. But if you look at the chronically homeless or unsheltered homeless, as your study suggested, which is, you know, 53% have serious mental health illness.
Or substance abuse.
Yes, but yeah, that's right. And then
it's
like,
not 53% have a serious mental illness. 53% have a serious mental illness or a treated substance abuse problem.
Right. Okay. So I get it. Yeah, right. So you're looking at and or. So if you're only look at people who have serious mental health illness, but no substance abuse, then that rate is lower among the chronically homeless.
Like I said, the rate of serious mental illness in the chronic homeless population is about 20%, 20 to 25%. And about half of those people have a co-occurring substance use disorder. Mm-hmm. So serious mental illness alone is about 12 to 15% of 10 to 12% of the chronic homeless population. But the overall homeless population, you know, has rates, if you include children and mothers and all of the adults, the rate of serious mental illness in the homeless population is around 7%.
Thank you for that. So I guess maybe I would ask you, there is a study that you co-authored called the New York evaluation that was really great. And so you showed that between 2000 and 2012, the street homeless people decreased from 16,000 to 2,000 in New York City. So can you tell us like what has contributed to that success?
So New York City had tremendous success in reducing unsheltered homelessness in the 1990s. And that was primarily between 1993 and 2003. We didn't get nightly counts until the early 2000s. And the baseline that we have is the 1990 census, which counted about 16,000 people living unsheltered in New York City. By 2003, 2004, that number had declined to about 3,000. So about an 80% decline in unsheltered homelessness over that period of time. What happened was, and most people know, there was an initiative called the New York initiative, where the state and the city got together and funded 4,500 roughly permanent supported housing slots for people who are chronically homeless with a mental illness. But the real engine of change was instead another program that's not as well known. It's called HASA, from the HIV/AIDS Services Administration. And what happened was New York City has a right to shelter. And advocates went to court in the early 90s arguing that people who had HIV, the right to shelter required that they had to have private bathroom and kitchen facilities, that their immunocompromised status made it unhealthy for them to be in a congregate shelter. And the court ruled in their favor. And so the city of New York, under the right to shelter consent decree, had to provide housing in some way for people who are HIV positive and homeless. And what they did was basically accelerated people's access to SSI, which is a supplemental security income stream. And they supplemented it with a housing allowance that gets paid directly to a housing provider that you can find. And over 30,000 people were housed in this program on a given night as of 2003, 2004. So far larger than the New York program, which gets a lot of the credit. But the real engine of change was this program, because most of the unsheltered homeless population had substance use issues, and many of them were injection drug users and were HIV positive. So it turned out that HIV and the susceptibility of people with HIV to getting sick from shelter exposures accelerated the decline in homelessness in New York City through this program. So tremendously successful. And I was part of the evaluation team that looked at that program. And the people who live in that housing are very, they high degree of satisfaction with their housing. They love the flexibility of the program because you can live with roommates, partners, family members, or friends. You don't have to just live in an efficiency apartment like most of our permanent supportive housing programs. So they love the flexibility, the mobility, and the ability to live with who they want. But it is mostly a shared housing program.
We know New York City, it's a tiny space, right? So where do they find housing units for all those individuals?
Right, because I hear this all the time that, oh, that program won't work in Los Angeles, let's say, because we don't have the units. Well, this program, was developed in New York City at a time when vacancy rate was less than 2%, the highest rental market cost in the country. And the bottom line is it's a shared housing program. So people are moving in with other people who have an extra room. Or if they're in a romantic partnership, they need a pillow and a pillowcase, and they don't, so it's not always the case that there has to be an empty market rate unit that's affordable to the person in order to get out of homelessness. And I think that the HASA program in New York City showed decisively that people can find their way into the existing market in shared living situations with family, friends, partners, roommates, or even in boarding situations, if they're given the opportunity to do so.
So in that program, the government, suppose I'm homeless, and then the government would give me subsidy, and I would use the money to go to the private market and find housing by myself.
That's correct. Or if you needed support and help in finding that unit or negotiating with the housing provider, then you can have someone we call a housing navigation case manager can help you get to the unit. So, but yeah, I think many people could solve the problem on their own, but oftentimes it may require that people will have the support of a case manager who help them get into that unit.
Do you think that model could be replicated in San Francisco or LA?
I think that the shared housing model is the future, and that that's the only way. It's going to be the #1 program that's going to be the engine of reducing homelessness in California. And because we're not going to build our way out of it. We didn't build our way out of it in New York City. So I think that the people in the homelessness sector, and I apologize if this sounds critical, but I think there's a paternalism streak, and there's also a kind of bit of a denial about some of the capabilities of people and the ingenuity and energy that people who are homeless can put into this situation. And they also seem to think that the only solution is an apartment by yourself. That's the only solution, is someplace, someone's got to be an apartment by yourself. Well, I got to tell you, I have a lot of friends who are renters. I don't know anyone who has an apartment by themselves. Everyone is living with partners, friends, or in a roommate situation. And yet we expect that the solution for all these people who are homeless has got to be this: everyone's going to be in their own apartment by themselves. It's not feasible. It's not realistic. And I don't think it respects meeting people where they are and what capabilities they have and the social and emotional resources that they can, advance on their own behalf.
So just for like our audience who may not know the difference between the shared housing program that you just talked about and permanent supportive housing, can you just clarify like the main difference between the two?
Permanent supportive housing was designed for a population with serious mental illness. So these are folks with a profound disability that very negatively impacts their ability to work, to negotiate certain situations, including finding their own apartments, negotiating leases with landlords, etc. So the supportive piece of the permanent supportive housing is that the key is there has to be a support service team that's helping this person to navigate those processes to get into a unit. I would say that those social services are the equivalent of the wheelchair ramp for a person who is disabled and trying to get into a unit and they need a wheelchair to get into the building. Well, people with severe mental illness, they need a social support team. That's their wheelchair ramp to get into a unit and to hang on to that unit and to become a good neighbor integrated with the community. And it's been incredibly successful. All the research shows that these programs are very successful. The shared housing is designed to be for a group that doesn't have as significant disabilities, will have the ability to live with others, and could negotiate that situation, whether that's in a shared domestic kind of situation as a roommate, family member, friend, or whether it's being a boarder in a house where they're renting out rooms, where they still have privacy. And the subsidy is not as deep. The permanent supportive housing relies on a housing choice voucher or the equivalent thereof, which is the HUD official federal voucher, which pays, the tenant pays 30% of their income, and then the government pays the difference between that and the market rent. But in the shared housing, we're talking more about a housing allowance that gets paid directly to the provider of that housing, even if it's a family, friend, relative, or a stranger in a boarding situation. And the subsidy, well, we don't have this program. in California right now, there are people who are discussing trying to have such a program, but it might pay something on the order of $600 to $800 a month toward rent, and the tenant would contribute a piece of their SSI income, because it would target people who are elderly or disabled.
So thank you for that. So seems to me that's more like a counterpart of the rapid rehousing program that we have in California, right? So it's more like a short-term subsidized, but I feel the difference is the rapid rehousing, you get 100% subsidy, whereas like in the shared program, you may have like a flexible rate negotiation with the government.
It's so the shared housing idea, by the way, the subsidy would not be short term. It could be 5 years in duration for some particular groups of people, maybe people who are in recovery, employable, whatever the case may be. But for people who are disabled or elderly and who can't work, then it could be a enduring subsidy that's ongoing. That's distinct from rapid rehousing. Rapid rehousing is really intended for people who are among those short-term homeless population, people who have had some kind of significant shock of some sort, loss of a job, hospitalization, maybe they were incarcerated for a few weeks, but they're likely to bounce back and get back on their feet within a year, because most rapid rehousing programs, they'll provide relocation grant, first last month's rent security deposit, and then up to 12 months of rental assistance after that, so that you can get a year lease that landlord knows they're going to get paid for that year. And the assumption is that these are folks who are going to be able to be back in the labor market, they're going to get back on their feet, and they can resume their rent thereafter. The VA's program recently added a second year of rental assistance for people who have not reached that level after 1 year of the program. So the rapid rehousing idea, it's essentially intended to give people an alternative to emergency shelter. Very important, because the thing that people most dislike about homelessness is having to be in emergency shelters or worse, on the street. So it's giving people an alternative, and it's helping them get back on their feet. It's not designed to be the same as a long-term subsidy. The pot of money that's committed to this has to roll over every year and serve a continuing flow of clients. Now, the subsidy could be deeper, it could be longer. All of that's, definitely worth figuring out the right sizing of it, but it's certainly going in the right direction, which is, let's use our resources to get people out of homelessness instead of burying all the money in these services that are just maintaining people in homelessness and not doing it well.
So I would like to ask you about maybe like the shared housing program. Would you worried about like some kind of moral hazard, and also would you worried about whether we can really help people get back on their feet and then help them exit the program gracefully?
So like all social programs, there's a moral hazard, right? That, there's an asymmetry of information. The client knows things, has private information they're not going to reveal. And I think we know every social program comes with sort of these moral hazards. And the best thing we can do is mitigate against abuse or fraud. But, the bottom line is that we're talking about a group of people here who are mostly pretty much destitute, and they literally have little or no money, and providing them with direct cash assistance or the equivalent thereof, paying people's rent, is just the most sensible direct thing we can do. If you're hungry, I can give you food, or I can go find some contractor who's going to go try to find food and bring it someplace, and then you got to go find it, and then you're going to pick up the food, right? No, just give people SNAP, and they can go to the grocery store and get their own food. Mm-hmm. So I think that there's an efficiency, a practicality, a directness, and a low overhead that makes it far preferable to just give people cash. I published a study last May that looked at the shelter industry, if you will, and estimates that the average shelter bed is $28,000 a year per person. That's about 2.5 times the cash value of a federal housing subsidy for 1 year, and the cost for a homeless family is around $80,000 a year. You could send your kid to Harvard and each year for that. You could, 5 families could have a housing choice voucher for the same cost of 1 shelter bed or 1 shelter unit for a family. So the shelter system is just another example of a very inefficient subsidy program that is, paying all these intermediaries. There's almost 200,000 people who work in the homelessness sector for, 400,000 beds. That's a tremendous number of employees as well. So the whole thing is, and by the way, it's mostly run by charities and organizations who have no obligation to do this work and could walk away from it tomorrow. And of course, because it's completely voluntary, that's why we have half the homeless population has no place to sleep. They live outside.
Right. I was going to ask you about the voluntary basis of a lot of the wraparound services to permanent supportive housing, right? So the original idea is you get permanent supportive housing and then you get support, right? You're supposed to get support from the service workers or whatever. But then I think in reality, a lot of those services were not received, or maybe the individual does not want to participate in the program, right?
Well, that's, part of life is that, we can't compel people to accept, services that they don't want to receive. And, I think that the services issue goes both ways. On the one hand, some of the organizations are not, being persistent in their follow-up and are not providing enough support. And we certainly did see that in some places in the VASH program, the VA's permanent supportive housing program that they have with HUD. But there's also, people who don't want the services. They might feel it's an intrusion on their privacy or that it's an unwanted form of surveillance. And if they're able to stay stable in their housing and they're a good neighbor, I don't see why they should be forced to accept services. Now, I think that the initial sort of agreement when you're taking someone from the street and putting them into a unit, you're paying for the unit, you're paying for the services, is you must open your door to a caseworker once a week for some period of time, just so they can check on you and make sure that you're surviving, you're feeding yourself, you're able to take care of your unit and yourself and be a good neighbor. But there's no reason that service has to go on indefinitely.
You said we cannot build our way out of the crisis. And then so I want to, maybe just read this news that I got yesterday, basically comparing the New York model with California. And then this person was very critical of the New York model where, he's basically saying, New York is spending $3 billion for the Department of Homeless Service. And the money goes to sustain a sprawling industry of shelter providers. And the private landlords charge exorbitant rents for changing motel rooms that the city will pay to keep families indoors. And so, and then that's like the person was very critical of the New York model and then says, California, don't do that. But then I feel on the other hand, California seems to me is already doing something similar. And we do have a sprawling industry of housing units, just permanent supportive housing or, nonprofits. So what do you think of that?
So that quote sounds like something I would have written because those are the aspects of the New York system. There are aspects of the New York system I'm very critical of. And I think that the right to shelter is one of those things. It has been successful as a way, particularly for people with HIV, to get into apartments. I think that's amazing, an amazing benefit of the right to shelter. But what it's mostly done is it has created a $3 billion industry. and a very significant government agency and bureaucracy whose primary focus, I won't say sole focus, but primary focus is meeting the obligation of the right to shelter. They're not trying to end homelessness. That $3 billion is not being used to solve people's homelessness. Most of it is simply being paid to provide shelter one day after another. And the cost of that shelter is exorbitant. And whether you're talking about the nonprofit providers, where last year we estimated it was about $80,000 per family, okay? Or whether you're talking about the private landlords who are charging triple market rate rents for master leases of buildings that the city contracts with. So I think that the right to shelter sets the bar too low and has institutionalized a costly non-solution to homelessness. And that really what we should have is a right to a homeless solution. You know, I'm not going to say a right to housing because that means something entirely different. But every person who's homeless should expect that government has an obligation to respond. And that obligation should be not only to keep you safe for the night, but to be working with you to solve your homelessness situation as expeditiously and efficiently as possible. Not running a institutionalized, expensive shelter system that is, you know, where the resources are mostly going to middle-class people who work in those facilities. Okay, so I would say don't do that, California.
We're not in a good situation either, right? So I feel in California, the common belief is housing first. And, from people from, Northern California all the way to Southern California, everybody's talking about housing first. And I know that, in order for organizations to receive state funding, they need to adopt that approach, which makes me feel that the term has morphed from housing first to housing only, so that we can't even talk about other reasons or other contributing factors. I'm curious about your thoughts on that.
So I support housing first as a policy framework. I love it as a bumper sticker slogan for what should be the mission of homeless services, because, the homeless service system can't replace the healthcare system, the mental health system, legal aid, dental clinics. I mean, people who are homeless, they need everything. And what we did for 20 years was we funded shelters to become multi-service social welfare healthcare organizations that essentially provided a low quality of service by unlicensed professionals to people. Okay, so that to me was the wrong direction. Housing first as a concept, as a principle, was a corrective to that, to say we should get people what they need most. And what the homeless system can deliver is getting people into housing. There are other systems charged with taking care of mental health and substance abuse. And by the way, they don't do that very well themselves. So I don't think the homeless system is going to do it better. So I understand that. But at the same time, yes, housing first has also become ideological. And some people just are holding on to it in a narrow interpretation, and that there can only be one way. When we know that, there's a lot of diversity in the population, and we have to figure out the solution for each person. And it always includes housing, and it should include as consumer choice as the priority. But some people want to live in clean and sober housing. They want to live in a congregate setting with other people like themselves. And it's not the dominant way. And some people actually can't live they have not been successful yet, let's say, in being able to live in an independent tenancy. And they need something like a safe haven where there's 24-hour supports, et cetera. So I think let's not get ideological about it, because I think that that's what you're saying, is that everyone has to have housing first philosophy. Well, it's very easy to say we do housing first, but it most definitely has never been intended to be housing only. I would definitely say that I don't think anyone who has worked in the field would ever say that it's housing only, but it's essentially saying this is where the homeless dollar should be spent, because no one else is spending money solving people's homelessness. And if we don't do it, no one else is going to do it. So we better make that the central purpose of what our assistance programs are doing.
So this is in California 2020 data. So we have about 110,000 unsheltered homeless. And then we have 50K chronic homeless. So even if we can build housing or somehow, using housing voucher or whatever to help the 50K chronic homeless, we still have 50K homeless that's unsheltered. That's this big gap. So
Right.
what can we do?
So, again, I would say that the Housing First was initially the concept, was the label was applied to a program called Pathways to Housing that was consumer-driven, supportive housing, maximizing choice, independence, etc. And the Housing First later was added on as a label. So that's why people associate it with that type of program, permanent supportive housing. But it has now been extended through the 2009 Hearth Act passed by the Congress. The overarching policy framework is Housing First. So not just for people who are chronically homeless, but also for people who experience short-term homelessness. So the rapid rehousing programs that have been established are also in spirit and in principle and in practice intended to be Housing First as well. So the idea is to extend the mission of the homeless assistance programs and focus it on housing, okay? And that's really what, as a slogan and as a policy principle, I think is how it's been applied. But there are, a large number of people who are unsheltered, who are living on the streets in California, who do so for a short-term basis. They're not there. People come in with campers and cars and trucks. And I know of recent data of a colleague who had a survey with phones and text messages with a sample of people in an area of Los Angeles. And within 6 months, half the sample had resolved their homelessness. They were no longer homeless. So as we've seen in the shelter situation, I think there's a significant number of the unsheltered population that is also on a very transitional basis. They're living unsheltered, but they're not staying there for long periods of time. Of course, there's a group who are, but I think there's a substantial portion who are turning over. So again, a program that helped those folks to get back into the housing market, that supported them in finding a solution, like very much again in the spirit of rapid housing, would be a good match for folks who are in that situation. Or even creating a permitting process that would enable people to use their vehicles or camp in a certain place, and that the permit is associated, however, with working in a rapid rehousing program, working on a transition plan. The problem is, we have to realize that the underlying problem is we don't have the resources to provide an exit plan for but 20% of the homeless population at best. So number one, we cannot take these programs to scale, and that's the big problem. And number two, we don't have the staff who are able to go out and do the appropriate level of outreach and engagement. We have a very small, in California, I'm speaking in particular, relatively small street outreach set of programs who have very high caseloads, and in many cases don't even get to know the names of people because they're just able to provide very little bits of assistance. So if we're serious about trying to actually get to scale with the resources to get people out of homelessness, these rapid rehousing programs or subsidies, and the people who can get out and enroll people and help them and get them through that process, those are the bigger challenges here, quite frankly. I'm much more concerned about those challenges than the barriers that individuals may face with their disabilities or behavior or what have you.
And so I'm not sure whether you've walked in San Francisco street or LA street recently, and then it's just everywhere you see, it's very visible, and you can see open drug scenes, you can see people, hallucinating and, bothering the neighbors. children don't want to play in certain neighborhood, women dare not to jog in certain neighborhood. So what can we do moving forward to save our cities?
I want to say I'm sympathetic to the plight of people in their communities, in their neighborhoods that are being so negatively impacted by homelessness. And I would just ask them to combine their concern with compassion, but also combine that compassion with sensible fixes of our safety net. Our safety net for people who are elderly and disabled is broken. We would not have in California, recently we looked in Los Angeles, 70% of the single adult homeless are either elderly or they're disabled. Now you can look at that and say, what's wrong with these people? Why are they psychotic and walking around like that? Why are they disturbing people, what have you? Or you can ask yourself, what is wrong with our social insurance programs for elderly and disabled people? What has broken about those programs, which were designed 50 years ago? What is wrong with those programs and how they're operating that is causing this situation? Because we've had elderly and disabled people all along, but they were not homeless, okay? And the escalation in homelessness isn't like, there hasn't been an outbreak of mental illness. Now, obviously, with the opiate crisis, the meth crisis, there's been a bit of an outbreak in substance addiction and overdose, and that is certainly, but that's a relatively smaller part of this larger problem, and they're affected by the housing market as well. But the question is, what about our safety net should we be fixing? And there are two core components to that. One is the income, which is paid through this program called supplemental security income. In California, it's $1,000 a month. And starting in 2015, the median fair market rent, or excuse me, the fair market rent for an efficiency apartment exceeded the total cash amount of SSI for the first time. And it has continued to escalate, such that now the gap between SSI and the fair market rent for an efficiency is about $700 per month, okay? So we have to make that SSI program function. It is supposed to be sufficient, either on its own or in combination with some housing allowance or subsidy. It should be enough to be able to afford the market rate housing, okay? So we're talking about something on the scale of another $800–900 a month. In addition, the SSI program is very difficult to get into and to navigate, especially for people who have behavioral health problems. And we have lots of elderly, older adult homeless. They're not elderly at age 65, but they have the conditions of elderly people at age 55. But they're not necessarily qualifying for SSI. So our safety net program for income insurance is broken. And so therefore we have all of these people who are homeless, who are destitute. They are simply lacking in basic cash income to be able to function in our society, okay? That's one. The second is Medicaid. We have this very large, the largest social welfare program in our country, other than Social Security. Medicaid is supposed to be providing healthcare and behavioral healthcare to people, especially these folks with disabilities. But the Medicaid system was designed as a clinic-based system and a hospital-based system. What we have in this homeless problem is a street and public destitution problem. In order to match the programs and services with the nature of the problem, we have to have a much more aggressive mobile healthcare and behavioral healthcare delivery system. We have to have pop-up tents everywhere that are providing open doors and access to behavioral healthcare and healthcare. Because right now these folks are locked out of that system because they can't get into these clinics, can't get into the primary care. I mean, even people with means can't get in to see a doctor these days because the length of lines to get in. And to navigate the SSI application process requires support. And so this is not going to magically just solve itself. We have to fix the safety net to meet the nature of the problem. And we've just been so letting it erode slowly over time to the point where now we're faced with this sort of catastrophic situation. And we can't blame citizens for being upset that they're living with the consequences of that. But at the same time, we have to be also blaming our government for having a failure of providing what is, clearly a government responsibility.
The SSI programs, and then there needs to be more community support, right, to help people apply, first of all, and to keep track of them and to get them to the clinics. And so you laid out all the reform and ideally, what the program should be looking like. So are you optimistic those changes would come anytime soon?
Well, I remain optimistic. I think I'm optimistic by nature, but I have seen tremendous successes in this space. Programs that have been developed, that evidence has been built around them, they've been scaled up, the work that's been done with veterans, the successes that are happening around homeless families, the successes that have been had with chronic homelessness in different places and in different times. So I am optimistic that we do know a lot, quite a bit, about what we need to do. Now, can we get the political will to do it? That is the main challenge. And, I don't think persuasion alone is going to do it. There's going to have to be some mobilization of political support by citizens, people who are threatened with homelessness or experience homelessness, people who face problems because of the housing shortage, because it's not just people who are homeless, people who face problems because their family members are struggling with these safety net issues, even if they're not homeless. There is a reason for common cause. And I'm hopeful that actually the catastrophic nature of the situation in California may motivate the political will that we need to actually try to make a big difference here.
I guess my last question is more on the numbers. So I recently, looked up how much we spent on homelessness, and you must know this very well, much better than me. But just it was very striking for me to see how much money we literally spend. So, for example, Governor Newsom, did a lot of work on converting motel rooms into homelessness units, and so guess how much he would spend? So it's about $150,000 to convert one unit into a homeless unit. And I just don't understand, are they painting the wall with gold or something? Why is that so expensive? Can you help me understand that?
Well, I think so. The cost of developing housing in California is incredibly high. It's an outlier. And the research I've read on it, attributes it to a few factors. One is the regulations that have, made it very difficult to build affordable housing because the requirements and such are that drives up the cost of doing a single unit and making a deal, getting a deal put together. The cost of land, because of the population pressures and the housing market pressures, the price of land is very high just to start with before you have nothing on it. And there's a lot of exclusionary zoning where communities, and there's of course a history in California of preserving sort of the privilege of certain communities before, I don't know what it was, 1975 or what have you. But there's zoning rules that make it very difficult to develop multifamily housing and affordable housing in communities. So it's a multifaceted problem. And I do realize that there are people in state government and private sector who are trying to undo some of these things. But at the end of the day, especially with the cost of land, what it is, building your way out of this problem is not going to happen. There has to be private market forces that are incentivized to profit from building housing, and enough housing that it actually gets the filtering process going again, so that there are units that trickle down to the lower income people, because people don't generally build housing en masse for low income people. low-income people move into units that have been vacated by people moving up into higher cost units or better quality units. And that's the system of filtering that is not happening. So there's a total housing supply problem in California that has to be addressed on its own. And that will only benefit people who are at risk of homelessness, because there will be more spaces for them to hold on to, and the prices will be more accessible, you know, if the market gets functioning again. But in the meantime, the tool we have is subsidies. That's what we can do, is we can help to bridge people's income with the cost of rent, and we can make those subsidies more flexible and more mobile. We do not have to just stick with the permanent supportive housing choice voucher model. And there are other ways we can help to subsidize people to make choices, and for housing providers to open up units, including in their homes and, you know, boarding units for people. So it's going to be a multifaceted process.
I totally agree. I mean, this is just my last follow-up with what you said. I mean, totally agree. The housing supply is in acute shortage, but at the same time, like I feel it's related to the supply of public good at a exorbitant cost. And so we don't just see that in housing, right? You mentioned how emergency shelters cost, I don't know, like tens of thousands of dollars, and then it's an emergency shelter. It's one bed. How can that cost so much, right?
Well, so the reason why shelters cost so much is because you have all these high costs associated with the facility. You know, even if people are only in the facility from 7 p.m. to 7 a.m., because it's an overnight shelter, there are still staff there 24/7. So you have to have 3 shifts of workers 7 days a week, okay? And you have to provide meals in a, you know, qualifying kitchen facility. You have to have insurance. You have to have security. You have administrative and management overhead. There's a huge fundraising apparatus at most of these facilities as well, because they have all these private events. 40% of the revenue for homeless shelters comes from private donations, okay? Government is a relatively small part of what's paying for shelter. But as a society, we're spending $13 billion a year on shelter, roughly. And you know, and when you count all the money spent on people unsheltered, when you add in the amount of money spent on excess use of healthcare services, hospitalizations that are unnecessary, emergency room visits unnecessary, arrests, incarcerations, etc., you add all of this up, and surely we are close to the $30 billion that it is estimated would cost to solve the housing affordability problem for all very low income Americans. So you would solve the problem for millions and millions of Americans at the same, as opposed to spending all of this money on what in the course of a year is just a couple million people, or at any given day is 700,000 or 800,000 people. So we're totally hurting ourselves. It's not in the best interest of us as a society to have organized ourselves in this way. And we have no choice but to like step back and let's start to fix the fundamentals. Mm-hmm. And let's get the fundamentals right. It's a foundation we can build on and where we can get success. But trying to eat away at this with all these haphazard little programs doing this and that and other thing, we'll never get there.
Yeah. Well, I know I am already out of my time. So I just want to say thank you so much. And this is really, really great. Every time when I talk with you, I just feel like I learned so much. And it's so pleasant to talk with you too. Okay. And I was telling Todd before you hopped on, I was like, he's a great person. He's just like so personable.
Well, so, I'm glad it went well. I hope it went fine.
Yes, yeah, definitely.
Thank you so much, Dennis.
All right, you're welcome, Todd. And thanks you, Jialu.
Thank you so much. Right. Have a good day.
See you guys later. Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye now.
Bye.
Bye.